Okay, what do you think of when you hear the word scientist? Often we think of a man in a white coat, maybe funny glasses, doing experiments, working with different substances. Well, in this book, Superwomen, Six Scientists Who Changed the World, written by Lori Lawler, the author gives us a story about 6 different women scientists. Now, this book is considered nonfiction, and does anyone remember what nonfiction means? So nonfiction means that is true information. There are facts in these books. And a book that is factual and is written about people is called a biography. So think of a time when you have learned about a historical person, either a president or other scientists or sports stars that you like. So this book is going to be written about these women's lives. But today we're only going to read about one of these scientists. And so I want you to listen for an interesting fact on this scientist and remember that interesting fact, and I want you to be able to tell me why you find it so interesting. So the scientist that we're going to read about, her name is Katherine Coleman Johnson. And when you have a nonfiction text, a lot of times they're a lot bigger than this one, but in any case, you can always open up the first couple of pages and find your table of contents. The table of contents here will tell you all of the information, the topics that you can read about in this book, and they'll tell you what page you can find them on. So since these topics are broken up by the individuals that the author is telling us about, we'll find Katherine Coleman Johnson's, and it shows us that she is chapter 3, and it begins on page 16. Okay, so when we get here and we see our title, Katherine Coleman Johnson, and this is where we're going to begin reading about her. Of the millions of Americans who watched live television coverage of the dramatic liftoff of Project Mercury's Freedom 7 at Cape Canaveral, Florida, at 9:30 Eastern Time on the morning of May 5th, 1961, few may have been as anxious as Katherine Coleman Johnson. Her mathematical computations were about to help send American astronaut Alan B. Shepard Jr. into orbit around the Earth. So much was riding on the mission's success. The United States was in a neck-and-neck race for space with the Soviet Union, which included what is now called Russia and other nearby countries. Just 3 weeks earlier, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had become the first man in space. Now, the United States hoped to overtake the Russian space program's lead by sending its first manned spacecraft into orbit. Unlike Gagarin, Shepard would be able to maneuver the spacecraft himself. Would everything go as planned? Nervously, 43-year-old Katherine watched as boosters roared beneath the 7-story high, 66,000-pound Redstone rocket. The ground shook. Slowly, Freedom 7 rose into the sky. Dozens of variables, everything from speed and atmosphere resistance to gravitational pull and time, had been used to calculate the launch, trajectory, orbit, and return flight of the spacecraft. Before the invention of reliable electronic computers, the accuracy and safety of spaceflight depended on people like Katherine and the rest of the Langley Field research team who crunched numbers with slide rules and mechanical calculators. The word computer was first used to describe the person who did the math, not the machine. The math equations of Katherine and her team of computers were checked and rechecked countless times. There could be no errors. Undoubtedly, Katherine breathed a sigh of relief when Freedom 7 reached the predicted altitude of 116 miles above Earth, orbited 15 minutes and 28 seconds at a velocity of 5,134 miles per hour, and pulled a maximum of 11 Gs. This meant that Shepard experienced 11 times the normal gravitational force that we feel on Earth. For 5 exciting minutes, Shepard also experienced weightlessness. Flawlessly, Shepard maneuvered the capsule's descent through the Earth's atmosphere and splashed down safely in the Atlantic Ocean, exactly on target. A waiting aircraft carrier, the USS Lake Champlain, sent a helicopter to retrieve Shepard inside the capsule. The capsule was deemed in such good shape by inspecting engineers that it would be reused. Shepard, too, survived the ordeal with flying colors. And I want to stop here and talk about a couple of the text structures that the author has used here. So one of the text structures the author has used is description. The author has given us a description of Katherine Coleman Johnson's job, that it was her job to calculate the space shuttle's safety into space, orbiting the Earth, and then the return. The author has also given us a problem and solution through that description, that they needed to get him safely into space and then back to Earth. Okay. Other features of nonfiction texts include pictures right here. So who do you think this is a picture of? Okay, let's read under here the caption that you'll usually find underneath all pictures to let you know what it is. In 1966, Katherine Coleman Johnson was one of a team of computers who did calculations with adding machines. So now we know what Katherine Coleman looks like. Let's continue. While Shepard experienced a hero's welcome with a medal from President John F. Kennedy and parades in cities across the country, the behind-the-scenes NASA technicians, engineers, and scientists went largely uncelebrated. However, for Katherine, Freedom 7 was a turning point in her life. "I have always loved the idea of going into space. I still do," she said. She knew that she was on the ground floor of something important, something big. The whole idea of going into space was new and daring. We were pioneers of the space era. As an African-American woman and a mathematician, she faced many obstacles working in a brand new science agency that was still almost entirely white and entirely male, except for the clerical staff. When she arrived at Langley, black computers were assigned to a segregated office. Women, even those with expertise, were told they could not attend meetings. While men with similar academic credentials were classified as professionals, women were sub-professionals and were paid substantially less. Women's names were not allowed on research reports they helped create. Okay, I want to stop here too and point out another text feature here. Under this photograph, let's read and see what the caption says. "All systems were go on May 5th, 1961, when Freedom 7 with astronaut Alan B. Shepard Jr. aboard successfully launched." Now you might not be able to tell from back here, but the word Freedom 7 is written in special print. It's bold in color. Anytime you see special print in these captions, that means it's an important word. So in this case, Freedom 7 is the name of the spacecraft that is going into space. So those are things you want to make sure that you are recognizing when you're reading nonfiction texts, are those special prints. Her computations were used to help track the 1962 trajectories of astronaut John Glenn's orbit around the Earth and return. She assisted on the team that developed navigational tools that astronauts could use if their spacecraft lost contact with ground control or computers failed. In preparation for the Apollo moon landing in 1969, she worked on the team that calculated the lunar orbit and landing of a spacecraft on the surface. Massive electronic computers located in California, across the country from Langley, were now being used extensively for calculations. However, they still weren't entirely trusted. What if they broke down? When a fuel tank exploded in 1970 on the Apollo 13 mission en route to the moon, onboard computers malfunctioned on the spacecraft. Katherine was part of the team assembled to monitor the flight of the spacecraft, which made it back safely to Earth. Nothing about her beginnings hinted that she would one day work in the high-tech field of space exploration. Okay, now before I read the next section, I just want to foreshadow a text structure that we'll see, that the author is going to use that of sequence. And we're going to learn a little bit about Katherine's upbringing before she became a scientist for NASA. And so when you encounter these in nonfiction texts, take note of the dates and the happenings and jot those down even on a timeline to help you keep track of what's going on and when it's happening. Katherine Coleman was born August 26, 1918, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the sleepy town of White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. She was the youngest of the 4 children of Joshua McKinley Coleman and Joylette Coleman. Her father, who had a 6th grade education, worked as a farmer and part-time laborer. Her mother was a former school teacher. From an early age, numbers fascinated Katherine. She loved to count. The steps to the road from her house, the steps up to the church, the number of dishes and silverware she washed. "Anything that could be counted, I did," she said. She was always eager to learn. She wanted to know everything she could about the world around her. The past was very much alive in the river valleys, hollows, and rugged foothills of her West Virginia home. People in her small rural town recalled clearly the bloody battles of the war between the states, commonly known as the Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865. The year before the war broke out, 490,000 slaves, almost a third of the state's total population, lived in Virginia, in West Virginia. When Catherine was a young girl, White Sulphur Springs was home to many ex-slaves and children of ex-slaves. They told stories of the hard times before slavery was abolished in 1865, when people of color were purchased and sold like property to work on nearby farms in Greenbrier County. By law, slaves had no constitutional rights. They could not testify in court against a white person, travel without permission, make a will, or own personal property. They could not marry without their master's consent. Teaching a slave to read or write was forbidden. Since they could be killed or sold with impunity, one of the greatest fears a slave faced was being separated from family and friends. Slaves were sold to other masters, rented out, used as prizes in raffles or wagers in card games and horse races. As for so many African Americans in White Sulphur Springs and the surrounding area, slavery cast a shadow on the Coleman family. They had lived in this part of the Appalachians as far back as 1799. Okay, and so the text goes on to tell more about Catherine's grandparents and her parents, but I want to make sure that we're pointing out some more of the text features that we are finding in nonfiction text. I'm going to go back one page. And here they're talking about the Mercury Project. So when you see photos in books, it's important to read all of the labels and the titles so you know better of what's going on. So down here where it says Mercury Project, let's read the caption. The first manned space mission for the United States, Project Mercury, depended on accurate mathematical calculations for liftoff, orbit, and reentry. And then as you look closer at the caption, or at the photograph, make sure you're reading the labels too. Doing this, it helps make better sense of the text when it shows you where the spacecraft was taking off from, that it was going out into the water, and then where the parachute was opening, and then where the astronaut would land to be retrieved by the ship. Sorry. Okay, so let's pick back up here a little bit more about Catherine Coleman's upbringing when she was off to high school. So Institute was the home of West Virginia Collegiate Institute, which had been called West Virginia Colored Institute until 1891. The all-black school provided a high school education, vocational training, and teacher preparation. It was considered the center of black intellectual life in the state and featured well-respected faculty, many of whom had gone to colleges in the North. Catherine entered the high school when she was only 10. Her teachers encouraged her to pursue mathematics. She worked with many wonderful mentors. She graduated from high school at age 15 and went on to earn a bachelor's degree in math and French in 1937. At that point, the school had been renamed West Virginia State University and had grown to 1,000 students. So Catherine goes on to study in math and physics at West Virginia State. Text talks about how she got married and had children. And then in 1952, a relative mentioned that jobs were opening up at what was the NASA National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA. It was the predecessor of NASA. And the jobs were open to African American women as computers at Langley Field Research Center in Virginia. Langley had been used during World War II to test fighter engines and perform research on aeronautics. The job seemed like a great opportunity. With her mathematics background, working 6 days a week, her starting salary was $1,662 per year. As a teacher in the rural South, she'd be lucky to make less than a third that amount. So Catherine goes on to be very successful in NASA. One of her proudest moments, she said, we can see pictured here. On November 24th, 2015, Catherine Coleman Johnson was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama in the East Room of the White House in Washington, D.C. So we've seen a lot of photographs in this specific nonfiction text, and the photographs are all accompanied with labels or captions underneath, or special print when we see bolded print. One last text feature I want to point out that's in many nonfiction texts is the glossary. You can find that in the back of your book. And the glossary is full of terms and their definitions that are important in a book like this. So in other sections and other biographies of other scientists, words like astronomy, astrophysics, biochemistry can all be looked up and found here on the glossary page. So After hearing a little bit about Katherine Coleman Johnson's life, did you pick out one thing that you found was interesting from her life? Go ahead and share with a partner something that you thought was interesting about Katherine Coleman Johnson and see if your neighbor had anything different to share.